The winter of 1885 brought more than just snow to Pine Valley. It brought a marriage that would change everything, and not in the way anyone expected. Thomas Mitchell, the wealthiest cattle baron in Wyoming Territory, agreed to marry a woman, sight unseen. A woman the townspeople called that strange, ugly spinster. But what Thomas discovered on their wedding night wasn't ugliness at all. It was a secret worth more than all his cattle combined. A secret that would test everything he thought he knew about value, about beauty, and about the price we pay for love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Mitchell stood at the edge of Evergreen Ranch, watching his empire stretch out before him. 6,000 acres, 15,000 head of cattle, and not a soul to share it with. At 34, his hair was already streaked with silver. At the temples, his face weathered from years under the Wyoming sun. His hands bore the calluses of someone who'd worked for everything he owned, despite what folks in Pine Valley whispered. "Man can't be that rich without being cold inside," they'd say at the Watering Hole Saloon. "Drives his men like they're just another herd." And perhaps there was truth to it. Thomas wasn't known for patience, for forgiveness, or for second chances. What he was known for was building the largest cattle operation in 3 territories from the meager 100 acres. His father left him. What good were soft hands in a land that took everything soft and broke it? The Mitchell house loomed behind him. 3 stories of ambition built from pine and determination. Too large for one man, his mother Elizabeth had told him before consumption. Took her 5 winters past. "This house needs children, Thomas, needs laughter. What good is all this without someone to leave it to?" Thomas had no answer then. He had no answer now as he watched Frank Wilson, his foreman of 12 years, approach on horseback. "Boss," Frank said, dismounting with a grunt. Frank was closer to 50 than 40, with a face like cracked leather and loyalty Thomas couldn't. "You buy with all his money. Sullivan's asking about that loan again, says he needs an answer by Friday." Thomas scowled. Edward Sullivan owned the bank in Pine Valley and had been trying to get his hooks into Evergreen Ranch since Thomas's father died. The drought had hit them hard last season, harder than Thomas let on. The loan would help them through until spring, but Sullivan's interest rates were highway robbery. "Tell him I'm thinking on it," Thomas said, though both men knew thinking wouldn't change the numbers in the ledger. Frank shifted uncomfortably. "There's something else. Letter came for you, from back east." Thomas took the cream-colored envelope, noting the Boston postmark and elegant handwriting. His mother's cousin, a woman he'd met once as a child and wrote to twice a year out of obligation more than affection. Later that evening, in the quiet of his study, Thomas read the letter by lamplight, a glass of whiskey forgotten at his elbow. His mother's cousin Harriet wrote of a woman, Clara Winters, a spinster of 30, educated but unfortunate in prospects and appearance, a woman seeking a fresh start out west, away from Boston society and its cruel whispers. "She needs a husband with means," Harriet wrote. "You need a wife to secure your legacy. She brings education, refinement, and a small inheritance that could help with your expansion plans. She asks only for respect and security, not love. Consider it, Thomas. Your mother would have wanted you settled." Thomas stared at the letter. For a long time, an arranged marriage to a woman he'd never met, a woman whose own family described her as unfortunate in appearance. It sounded like the kind of business transaction he understood. No messy emotions, no unrealistic expectations. Just a simple exchange, security for legacy. The next morning, he sent his reply. 3 months later, Clara Winters was due to arrive. By train, Pine Valley buzzed with gossip when word of Thomas Mitchell's impending marriage spread. Mabel Jenkins, who owned the Watering Hole Saloon, couldn't serve whiskey fast enough to keep up with the thirst for rumor. "Heard she's so ugly even her parents couldn't look at her," said Jessie Cooper, one of Thomas's ranch hands. "Rich city girl buying herself a husband out west where standards are lower." "Mitchell's buying himself an heir, more like," countered Sheriff Davis, nursing his coffee. "Man cares more about that ranch than his own heart." Dr. Harper, tending to a patient's split lip from a bar fight the night before, offered his professional opinion. "Beauty fades, character remains." Perhaps Mr. Mitchell has finally recognized that fact. But Thomas heard none of this as he stood on the train platform that crisp October morning. The Boston train was scheduled to arrive at noon. He wore his finest suit, dark wool barely worn, and had even allowed himself the extravagance of a new hat. Not for vanity, he told himself, for respect. This was, after all, a business arrangement. When the train's whistle pierced the air, Thomas straightened his back. Several passengers disembarked, a businessman, a young couple, a family with tired children, and then a woman wearing a heavy traveling cloak and a dark veil that completely obscured her face. She approached slowly, a small valise in her gloved hand. "Mr. Mitchell?" Her voice was soft but clear, educated in its pronunciation. "Miss Winters," he replied with a nod. "Welcome to Pine Valley." "Thank you for meeting me," she said, making no move to lift her veil. "I hope your generosity in this arrangement won't be something you come to regret." Thomas offered his arm, aware of the stares from townspeople lingering nearby. "My carriage is waiting. We can speak more privately at the ranch." The ride to Evergreen Ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Thomas noted that Clara sat with perfect posture despite the rutted road, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The veil remained in place. "You may remove that if it's more comfortable," he finally said, gesturing to the veil. "There's no one to see now." "I prefer to wait," she replied. "First impressions matter, Mr. Mitchell. I'd rather ours be handled carefully." Something in her tone, measured, intelligent, caught his attention. This was not the desperate, grateful woman he had expected. The main house at Evergreen Ranch emerged from the pine forest like a declaration. Two-story wraparound porch, gleaming windows, a statement of prosperity in a territory where most still lived in one-room cabins. Thomas watched Clara's veiled face turn to take it in. "It's magnificent," she said simply. Inside, Ruth Bennett, a local widow Thomas had hired to serve as housekeeper and now as Clara's lady's maid, waited to show Clara to her quarters. "You'll want to rest after your journey," Thomas said formally. "We can discuss arrangements for the ceremony over dinner." Clara nodded, following Ruth up the grand staircase. Thomas watched them go, an unsettled feeling in his chest. He had agreed to marry a woman he'd never seen, whose own family described her as unfortunately plain. A woman who hid behind a veil and spoke with the confidence of someone with choices. Dinner was served at 7 in the formal dining room. Thomas sat at the head of a table too large for two, surrounded by the trappings of wealth. Silver candelabras, fine china, crystal glasses that suddenly seemed hollow. Clara entered wearing a high-necked dark blue dress, simple but well-tailored. The veil was gone, replaced by a lace scarf draped artfully over the left side of her face, obscuring it from view. The right side showed a woman with delicate features. One, bright blue eye, fair skin, and a small, serious mouth. Thomas rose, his stomach tightening with uncertainty. "Miss Winters?" "Mr. Mitchell." She took her seat, arranging her napkin with practiced grace. "Your home is even more impressive by candlelight." Throughout the meal, Thomas found himself studying what he could see of her face, trying to imagine what lay beneath the scarf. A burn, a birthmark. Whatever it was, Clara ate with refinement, spoke intelligently about books and current events, and asked thoughtful questions about the ranch operations. "Your cousin Harriet mentioned you were educated," Thomas said, as the main course was cleared. "Radcliffe College," Clara replied, "though many would say it was wasted on someone with my limitations. "And what would you say?" Thomas asked, surprising himself with his interest. Clara's visible eye met his directly. "I would say that education is never wasted, Mr. Mitchell. Knowledge doesn't care about the vessel that contains it." After dinner in the study, Thomas poured brandy for himself and offered some to Clara, who declined with a small shake of her head. "I believe we should address the practical matters," she said. "I understand this is a marriage of convenience. I don't harbor romantic notions, Mr. Mitchell." Thomas nodded, relief and something like disappointment mingling in his chest. "I can provide financial security, a respectable position in the community, and comfortable living conditions. In return, I will manage your household, provide educated conversation, and bear your children if nature allows," Clara finished matter-of-factly. "I understand the terms, Mr. Mitchell." The directness of her words about children made his collar feel suddenly tight. "Yes, well, as to your condition," he gestured vaguely toward the scarf, "I don't require that you remove it in your presence." A hint of bitterness crept into her voice. "How generous of you, Mr. Mitchell. Most men would at least want to see what they're purchasing." Thomas flinched at her phrasing. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "That's not what Isn't it?" Clara stood smoothly. "You agreed to marry a woman described as unfortunate in appearance, because she comes with money you need and the potential for heirs. I agreed to marry a stranger in a territory I've never visited because my options in Boston were limited by something I cannot change. Let's not pretend this is anything but what it is." Thomas found himself speechless. This woman, this veiled, sharp-tongued stranger, was nothing like the docile, grateful bride he had anticipated. "The Reverend Adams can perform the ceremony on Sunday," he finally said, "unless you need more time to prepare." "Sunday is acceptable," Clara replied, moving toward the door. "Good night, Mr. Mitchell." After she left, Thomas poured another brandy. Unsettled by the encounter, Clara Winters might be hiding her face, but there was nothing hidden about her mind. For the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated what he was getting himself into. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparations. Thomas found himself unusually busy with ranch matters, conveniently absent when Clara toured the property with Ruth as her guide. Frank reported that the mysterious bride-to-be had visited the kitchen gardens, the stables, even the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. "She asked smart questions," Frank said, clearly impressed despite himself. "Wanted to know about feed costs, breeding schedules, water access, not the usual ladies' interests." On Saturday evening, Thomas was surprised to find Clara in his study, examining the ledger books he'd left open on his desk. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, not sounding particularly sorry. "But if I'm to be mistress of this house, I should understand its finances." Thomas approached, noticing she wore the scarf again, always carefully arranged to cover the left side of her face. "Those are complex matters, Miss Winters. Not typically the concern of women," Clara finished, her visible eye challenging him. "I managed my father's household accounts from the age of 16 until his death last year, Mr. Mitchell. Numbers don't confound me." Thomas felt a flash of irritation, then curiosity. "And what do you make of these numbers, then?" Clara traced a column with one gloved finger. "I'd say you're over-leveraged on your northern expansion. The drought has left you cash poor despite your assets, and Edward Sullivan's loan terms will bleed you dry within 2 years if the conditions don't improve." Thomas stared at her, caught between outrage at her presumption and grudging admiration for her accuracy. "My financial matters are about to become our financial matters," Clara interrupted. "My inheritance isn't large by Boston standards. but it would cover your immediate obligations without Sullivan's usurious interest rates. I didn't agree to this marriage for your money, Thomas said stiffly. Clara's mouth curved slightly. Didn't you? There's no shame in it, Mr. Mitchell. It's a fair exchange. Sunday dawned clear and cold. The ceremony in the ranch's front parlor was brief, attended only by Frank as witness, Ruth as support for Clara, and Reverend Adams, who looked curiously at Clara's veiled face, but asked no questions. Clara wore a simple cream-colored dress, her face completely covered by a thicker veil than before. When Reverend Adams pronounced them man and wife, Thomas hesitated at the instruction to kiss his bride. Clara solved his dilemma by offering her hand instead. Thomas took it, noting its warmth through the glove, and brought it briefly to his lips. That evening, after a quiet dinner, Thomas found himself standing awkwardly outside Clara's bedroom door. Their arrangement had been clear, yet the reality of it now loomed uncomfortable and strange. He knocked softly. After a moment, Clara's voice invited him in. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp. Clara sat at the vanity, her back to him, still fully dressed. In the mirror's reflection, Thomas could see she wore no veil, no scarf, but her face was turned away from the glass. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, "my husband." "Mrs. Mitchell," he replied, the name foreign on his tongue. He cleared his throat. "I want you to know that I don't expect... That is, we can wait until you're more comfortable with showing you my face." Clara finished, still not turning. "That's the true test, isn't it? Whether the cattle baron can stomach his ugly bride long enough to produce an heir?" Thomas flinched at her bluntness. "That's not what I..." "It's all right, Thomas," she said, using his given name for the first time. "I've lived with this face for 30 years. I know what effect it has on people." Slowly, she turned to face him. Thomas's breath caught. The left side of Clara's face was marked by a red birthmark that spread from her temple down her cheek to the corner of her mouth. Her left eye, blue like the right, was partially surrounded by the discoloration. But it wasn't the birthmark that struck him speechless. It was the fact that despite it, or perhaps because of the character it gave her face, Clara Winters Mitchell was beautiful. Not in the conventional way of painted ladies or society debutantes, but with a striking uniqueness that commanded attention: high cheekbones, intelligent eyes, a mouth that even now curved slightly at his stunned expression. "Not what you expected?" she asked, a vulnerability beneath her composed tone. Thomas found his voice. "No," he admitted honestly. "It's not." Clara nodded once, shoulders stiffening. "I understand if you prefer I resume wearing the veil in your presence." "That's not..." Thomas stepped closer, seeing the birthmark for what it was. Skin, nothing more, nothing less. "You're not ugly, Clara." A flash of something, anger, pain, crossed her face. "Don't patronize me, Mr. Mitchell. I've endured quite enough of that in my life." "I'm not," Thomas said, surprising himself with his vehemence. "Boston society may have its rigid notions of beauty, but out here we value different things: strength, resilience, intelligence." He gestured to the window, to the harsh, beautiful landscape beyond. "This land doesn't care about perfect features. It cares about survival." Clara studied him, searching for mockery and finding none. "And you, Thomas Mitchell, what do you care about?" The question hung between them, unexpectedly weighty. Thomas had built his life around acquisition. More land, more cattle, more wealth. He had never stopped to consider what truly mattered to him. Looking at Clara, really looking at her, he felt something shift inside him. This woman had faced a world that judged her harshly and built herself anyway, educated, composed, unbroken. "I'm beginning to think," he said slowly, "that I care about things I never recognized before." Clara's expression softened slightly. "Then perhaps this arrangement may prove beneficial in ways neither of us anticipated." Thomas nodded, suddenly aware of the distance between them and how much he wanted to close it. "May I?" he asked, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Clara placed her hand in his. Thomas drew her gently to her feet, then, with careful movements, reached up to touch the marked side of her face. Clara flinched slightly but didn't pull away. "Your birthmark doesn't define you," he said quietly, "just as my ranch doesn't define me, though I suspect we've both forgotten that truth at times. It's not always easy to separate ourselves from how the world sees us," Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then perhaps," Thomas said, "we should help each other remember." That night, they didn't consummate their marriage. Instead, they talked, really talked, until the lamp burned low. Clara spoke of growing up marked in a society obsessed with perfection. Thomas shared the crushing responsibility of building on his father's legacy while watching his mother fade away. Two people who had carried their burdens alone for so long, suddenly finding that sharing them made them lighter. And in the months that followed, Pine Valley watched in amazement as Thomas Mitchell, the cold-hearted cattle baron, was transformed by the woman they had expected to pity. Clara walked through town without her veil, her head high despite the stares. She implemented new breeding programs that increased the ranch's productivity. She started a small school for the ranch hands, children, teaching them herself 3 afternoons a week. When Edward Sullivan came calling about the loan, Clara met him in Thomas's study, ledgers open before her, and outlined exactly why his services would no longer be required. The banker, left with his hat crushed between his hands, outmaneuvered by the woman he'd called Mitchell's pitiful mail-order bride behind closed doors. By spring, when the wildflowers bloomed across the valley, Thomas Mitchell looked at his wife, her birthmark now as familiar to him as his own reflection, and realized that their business arrangement had become something neither of them had dared hope for, something true and sustaining, like the land itself. "I never thought I could be so fortunate," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. Clara smiled, no longer hiding any part of herself. "Nor did I," she admitted. "I came west expecting security, not happiness." Thomas took her hand, still amazed by how perfectly it fit in his. "I thought I was agreeing to marry an ugly woman," he said with quiet honesty. "Instead, I married the most beautiful person I've ever known." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Evergreen Ranch, Thomas Mitchell understood that true value had nothing to do with cattle or land or even physical beauty. It was found in courage, in resilience, in the ability to see beyond surfaces to the heart beneath. Clara had seen him, not just the successful cattle baron, but the lonely boy still trying to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. And he had seen her, not a marked face, but a remarkable woman who had refused to be diminished by the world's narrow judgments. In the end, what shocked Thomas Mitchell wasn't that he'd married a woman others called ugly. What shocked him was how blind he had been his entire life to what real beauty truly was, until Clara showed him how to see. Pine Valley buzzed with gossip when word of Thomas Mitchell's impending marriage spread. Mabel Jenkins, who owned the Watering Hole Saloon, couldn't serve whiskey fast enough to keep up with the thirst for rumor. "Heard she's so ugly, even her parents couldn't look at her," said Jessie Cooper, one of Thomas's ranch hands. "Rich city girl buying herself a husband. Out west, where standards are lower. Mitchell's buying himself an heir, more like," countered Sheriff Davis, nursing his coffee. "Man cares more about that ranch than his own heart." Dr. Harper, tending to a patient's split lip from a bar fight the night before, offered his professional opinion. "Beauty fades, character remains. Perhaps Mr. Mitchell has finally recognized that fact." But Thomas heard none of this as he stood on the train platform that crisp October morning. The Boston train was scheduled to arrive at noon. He wore his finest suit, dark wool, barely worn, and had even allowed himself the extravagance of a new hat. Not for vanity, he told himself, for respect. This was, after all, a business arrangement. When the train's whistle pierced the air, Thomas straightened his back. Several passengers disembarked. A businessman, a young couple, a family with tired children, and then a woman wearing a heavy traveling cloak and a dark veil that completely obscured her face. She approached slowly, a small valise in her gloved hand. Mr. Mitchell. Her voice was soft but clear, educated in its pronunciation. Miss Winters, he replied with a nod. Welcome to Pine Valley. Thank you for meeting me, she said, making no move to lift her veil. I hope your generosity in this arrangement won't be something you come to regret. Thomas offered his arm, aware of the stares from townspeople lingering nearby. My carriage is waiting. We can speak more privately at the ranch. The ride to Evergreen Ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Thomas noted that Clara sat with perfect posture despite the rutted road, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The veil remained in place. You may remove that if it's more comfortable, he finally said, gesturing to the veil. There's no one to see now. I prefer to wait, she replied. First impressions matter, Mr. Mitchell. I'd rather ours be handled carefully. Something in her tone, measured, intelligent, caught his attention. This was not the desperate, grateful woman he had expected. The main house at Evergreen Ranch emerged from the pine forest like a declaration. Two-story wraparound porch, gleaming windows, a statement of prosperity in a territory where most still lived in one-room cabins. Thomas watched Clara's veiled face turn to take it in. It's magnificent, she said simply. Inside, Ruth Bennett, a local widow Thomas had hired to serve as housekeeper and now as Clara's lady's maid, waited to show Clara to her quarters. You'll want to rest after your journey, Thomas said formally. We can discuss arrangements for the ceremony over dinner. Clara nodded, following Ruth up the grand staircase. Thomas watched them go, an unsettled feeling in his chest. He had agreed to marry a woman he'd never seen, whose own family described her as unfortunately plain, a woman who hid behind a veil and spoke with the confidence of someone with choices. Thomas retreated to his study, where Frank waited with updates on the northern pasture fence repairs. For an hour, he immersed himself in ranch matters, grateful for the distraction. But his mind kept returning to the veiled woman upstairs, to her poised manner and what secrets that heavy veil might conceal. You seem distracted, boss, Frank observed after Thomas asked him the same question twice. Having second thoughts about the arrangement, Thomas frowned. It's a practical solution to a practical problem, Frank, nothing more. Frank, who had been with Thomas long enough to speak his mind, shook his head. Marriage ain't like buying cattle. Can't just pick the best breeding stock and expect it to work out neat and tidy. I'm not discussing this further, Thomas said sharply. Send Jesse to check the creek crossing. That bridge won't survive another heavy rain. After Frank left, Thomas poured himself a small whiskey, staring out the window at the mountains in the distance. He had built everything around him through calculation and control. This marriage would be no different. Clara Winters needed security. He needed an heir and her financial contribution. It was a fair trade, regardless of what lay beneath that veil. At precisely 7 o'clock, Thomas entered the dining room to find Clara already seated, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table's edge. She had changed into a high-necked dark blue dress, simple but well-tailored. The veil was gone, replaced by a lace scarf draped artfully over the left side of her face, obscuring it from view. The right side showed a woman with delicate features, one bright blue eye, fair skin, and a small, serious mouth. Thomas paused in the doorway, his practiced greeting forgotten. He had prepared himself for ugliness, for deformity perhaps, but the half face before him showed nothing but refined beauty. It was the hidden half that made his pulse quicken with curiosity. "Miss Winters," he said, recovering himself as he moved to his seat at the head of the table. "Mr. Mitchell." She inclined her head slightly. "Your home is even more impressive by candlelight." Ruth served the first course, a hearty potato soup with fresh bread. Thomas watched as Clara ate with measured grace, taking small, neat spoonfuls. She handled her partial concealment with practiced ease, adjusting the scarf minimally as needed. "I trust your quarters are satisfactory," Thomas said, searching for neutral conversation. "More than satisfactory," Clara replied. "Ruth has been most attentive. She mentioned you lost your mother some years ago. I'm sorry for your loss." The personal observation caught Thomas off guard. 5 years this winter. Consumption. "My father passed last year," Clara offered. "A stroke. It was mercifully quick." Thomas nodded, understanding the sentiment. "And your mother?" "When I was 12. She never quite recovered from my birth." Clara's visible eye met his directly. "My condition was something of a shock to her. So it was a birthmark, or congenital issue," Thomas thought. Not an accident or injury. He wanted to ask more, but sensed her reluctance. Instead, he redirected. "Your cousin mentioned you were educated." "Radcliffe College," Clara replied, "though many would say it was wasted on someone with my limitations." "And what would you say?" Thomas asked, surprising himself with his genuine interest. Clara's visible eye met his directly. "I would say that education is never wasted, Mr. Mitchell. Knowledge doesn't care about the vessel that contains it." The statement hung between them, thoughtful and unexpected. Thomas found himself reassessing his assumptions about this arrangement. Clara Winters might be physically flawed, but her mind was evidently sharp. Throughout the meal, they maintained cordial, if somewhat stilted, conversation. Clara asked intelligent questions about the ranch operations, the local economy, and the history of Pine Valley. Thomas found himself explaining the complexities of cattle breeding and water rights with more detail than he'd intended, drawn in by her attentive listening and insightful follow-up questions. By the time dessert was served, apple pie with cream, Thomas had nearly forgotten about the scarf covering half her face. Nearly, but not quite. The mystery of what lay beneath pulled at him, not with revulsion, but with a curiosity he couldn't quite suppress. "Will you show me the rest of the house tomorrow?" Clara asked, as Ruth cleared their plates. "I should like to understand the home I'll be managing." "Of course," Thomas replied, "though I should warn you, parts of it remain unfinished. My mother had grand plans that I never completed after her passing. Perhaps we could finish them together," Clara suggested, then immediately added, "as a practical matter, of course. A proper home adds value to the property." Thomas nodded, aware that they were both carefully maintaining the pretense that this was nothing more than a business arrangement. "Shall we retire to the study? There are matters we should discuss before Sunday." In the study, Thomas poured brandy for himself and offered some to Clara, who declined with a small shake of her head. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shifting shadows across the room. Clara took a seat in the leather chair opposite his desk, arranging her skirts with deliberate movements. "I believe we should address the practical matters," she said. "I understand this is a marriage of convenience. I don't harbor romantic notions, Mr. Mitchell." Thomas nodded, relief and something like disappointment mingling in his chest. "I can provide financial security, a respectable position in the community, and comfortable living conditions. In return, I will manage your household, provide educated conversation, and bear your children if nature allows," Clara finished matter-of-factly. "I understand the terms, Mr. Mitchell." The directness of her words about children made his collar feel suddenly tight. "Yes, well, as to your condition," he gestured vaguely toward the scarf, "I don't require that you remove it in your presence." A hint of bitterness crept into her voice. How generous of you, Mr. Mitchell. Most men would at least want to see what they're purchasing. Thomas flinched at her phrasing. That's not what I... Isn't it? Clara stood smoothly. You agreed to marry a woman described as unfortunate in appearance because she comes with money you need and the potential for heirs. I agreed to marry a stranger in a territory I've never visited because my options in Boston were limited by something I cannot change. Let's not pretend this is anything but what it is. Thomas found himself speechless. This woman, this veiled, sharp-tongued stranger, was nothing like the docile, grateful bride he had anticipated. Her assessment was brutally honest, stripping away any pretense of nobility from their arrangement. The Reverend Adams can perform the ceremony on Sunday, he finally said, unless you need more time to prepare. Sunday is acceptable, Clara replied, moving toward the door. Good night, Mr. Mitchell. After she left, Thomas poured himself another brandy, unsettled by the encounter. Clara Winters might be hiding her face, but there was nothing hidden about her mind. For the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated what he was getting himself into. The next morning, Thomas rose early, as was his habit, breakfasting alone before the household stirred. He had work to attend to, a meeting with cattle buyers from Cheyenne, fence repairs to oversee, an accounting of winter feed, supplies, normal concerns that now felt trivial compared to the fact that in 3 days he would be marrying a woman he barely knew. He was saddling his horse when he caught sight of Clara walking alone through the kitchen garden, a shawl drawn over her shoulders against the morning chill. She wore the scarf again, carefully arranged to cover the left side of her face. In the clear light of day, she moved with a quiet confidence, stopping occasionally to examine the late-season vegetables and herbs. Thomas found himself watching longer than he intended, struck by the contradiction she presented, part hidden, part revealed, entirely enigmatic. When she turned and saw him, he felt oddly like a trespasser on his own property. Mr. Mitchell, she called, giving a small nod of acknowledgement. Good morning. Thomas approached, leading his horse. Miss Winters, I hope you slept well. Well enough, thank you, she replied. Your garden is well planned but neglected. The rosemary is overcrowded, and the sage should have been harvested weeks ago. The criticism, delivered matter-of-factly, was so unexpected that Thomas nearly laughed. My mother was the gardener. I'm afraid I've limited my attention to what produces profit. Not everything of value appears on a ledger, Mr. Mitchell. Clara reached out to snap a sprig of rosemary, rolling it between her gloved fingers. This garden could provide much of your household's needs with proper care. Then consider it your domain, Thomas said. Change whatever you see fit. Clara studied him for a moment, her visible eye assessing. You offer control very easily. For a man known to keep a tight rein on his affairs. It's a garden, Miss Winters, not a cattle drive. And yet it's the principle that matters, isn't it? She tucked the rosemary into her pocket. You've built this ranch through complete control. Now you're inviting a stranger to alter parts of it. Thomas hadn't considered it that way. Perhaps I recognize when someone has expertise I lack. A rare quality in powerful men, Clara observed. I shall take you at your word and revive the garden. A small test of our arrangement, shall we say. Before Thomas could respond, she had moved past him, heading back toward the house. He watched her go, struck by the feeling that Clara Winters had somehow gained the upper hand in an exchange he hadn't realized was a negotiation. Throughout the day, as Thomas rode the property and met with the cattle buyers, his thoughts kept returning to Clara. She defied every expectation he had formed based on Harriet's letter. Her physical flaw, whatever it might be, seemed to have forged a woman of uncommon directness and intelligence. Rather than being beaten down by the world's judgment, she had developed a sharp edge. That evening, returning late from the northern pasture, Thomas was surprised to find a lamp still burning in his study. Inside, Clara sat at his desk, ledger books open before her. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, not sounding particularly sorry. "But if I'm to be mistress of this house, I should understand its finances." Thomas approached, noticing she wore the scarf again, always carefully arranged to cover the left side of her face. "Those are complex matters, Miss Winters. Not typically the concern of women," Clara finished, her visible eye challenging him. "I managed my father's household accounts from the age of 16 until his death last year, Mr. Mitchell. Numbers don't confound me." Thomas felt a flash of irritation, then curiosity. "And what do you make of these numbers, then?" Clara traced a column with one gloved finger. "I'd say you're over-leveraged on your northern expansion. The drought has left you cash poor despite your assets, and Edward Sullivan's loan terms will bleed you dry within 2 years if the conditions don't improve." Thomas stared at her, caught between outrage at her presumption and grudging admiration for her accuracy. "My financial matters are about to become our financial matters," Clara interrupted. "My inheritance isn't large by Boston standards, but it would cover your immediate obligations without Sullivan's usurious interest rates." "I didn't agree to this marriage for your money," Thomas said stiffly, though they both knew it had been part of the calculation. Clara's mouth curved slightly. "Didn't you? There's no shame in it, Mr. Mitchell. It's a fair exchange." Thomas moved to the window, uncomfortable with her directness. Outside, darkness had fallen, transforming the glass into a mirror that reflected the room behind him, the rich furnishings, the crackling fire, Clara still seated at his desk like she already belonged there. "Sullivan has been trying to get control of the northern watershed for years," he said finally. "The loan was his way in." "Men like Sullivan mistake financial necessity for weakness," Clara replied. "A common error. One we can use to our advantage." "We?" Thomas turned to face her. "Is that not the purpose of this arrangement, a partnership of mutual benefit?" Clara closed the ledger carefully. "Unless you prefer a wife who limits her attention to menu planning and embroidery." The question hung between them, a challenge, an offering, a redefinition of their understanding. Thomas had expected a damaged woman grateful for security. Instead, he had found a mind as sharp as his own, offering more than just her name and the promise of children. "I've never had a partner," he admitted. "The ranch has always been my responsibility alone." "And how has that served you?" Clara asked. "Working yourself to exhaustion, borrowing against your future, isolating yourself from the very community your success depends upon." Her assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Thomas had built Evergreen Ranch through sheer force of will, refusing help, advice, or partnership. Even Frank, loyal as he was kept at arm's length when it came to true decision-making. "You seem to have formed a complete opinion of me in less than 2 days, Miss Winters," Thomas said, a defensive edge in his voice. "Just as you formed an opinion of me before I ever stepped off that train," Clara countered. "Perhaps we're both due for reconsideration." She stood, smoothing her skirts with practiced hands. In the firelight, the visible half of her face was striking. High cheekbones, straight nose, intelligent eye. Thomas found himself wondering again what lay beneath the scarf, not with dread, but with increasing curiosity. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "A true partnership," Clara replied. "Your knowledge of this land and cattle, combined with my financial acumen and education. Your strength and my strategy. A marriage not just in name, but in purpose." It was more than Thomas had anticipated, more than he had allowed himself to hope for. A wife who might be more than a bearer of children or a keeper of his home. A true ally. "And in return?" he asked, because there was always a price. "Respect," Clara said simply. "Not pity, not tolerance. Respect for my mind, if not—" She gestured to the covered portion of her face. Well, we can't always get everything we want, can we? The self-deprecation in her tone struck Thomas unexpectedly. Beneath her confidence and sharp intellect, there was a vulnerability. A woman who had learned early that the world would see only her flaw, never her value. "Respect can be earned, Miss Winters," he said carefully, "and from what I've seen, you're well on your way to earning mine." Something flickered across Clara's visible features, surprise perhaps, or cautious hope. "Then I believe we understand each other, Mr. Mitchell." As she moved toward the door, Thomas found himself wanting to ask her to stay, to continue their conversation. It had been years since he'd engaged in discourse that challenged him intellectually. Even the cattle buyers, with their market analyses and pricing strategies, presented puzzles he had long since solved. "Miss Winters," he called, as she reached the threshold. "Would you join me for breakfast tomorrow? There are aspects of the ranch operations I think might interest you." Clara paused, studying him with that measured gaze. "I'd like that," she said finally. "Good night, Mr. Mitchell." "Good night, Miss Winters." As she disappeared down the hallway, Thomas returned to his desk, where the ledgers still lay open. He ran his finger along the column Clara had identified. The over-leveraged northern expansion. She was right, of course. The drought had left him vulnerable at precisely the wrong moment, and Sullivan was circling like a vulture. Thomas closed the ledger, a new resolve forming in his mind. Perhaps this marriage of convenience might prove more valuable than he had imagined, not just for his bloodline or his bank account, but for the future of Evergreen Ranch itself. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the distant sound of coyotes. Winter was coming, and with it, challenges that would test every resource Thomas Mitchell possessed. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of optimism, not because his problems were solved, but because he might no longer face them alone. Sunday dawned clear and cold. The ceremony in the ranch's front parlor was brief, attended only by Frank as witness, Ruth as support for Clara, and Reverend Adams, who looked curiously at Clara's veiled face but asked no questions. Clara wore a simple cream-colored dress, her face completely covered by a thicker veil than before. When Reverend Adams pronounced them man and wife, Thomas hesitated at the instruction to kiss his bride. Clara solved his dilemma by offering her hand instead. Thomas took it, noting its warmth through the glove, and brought it briefly to his lips. "May God bless this union," Reverend Adams said with solemn formality, though his eyes betrayed curiosity about the unusual couple before him. After the Reverend departed, Frank clasped Thomas's shoulder with a weathered hand. "Congratulations, boss, Mrs. Mitchell." He nodded respectfully toward Clara. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," Clara replied. "I hope we'll have the opportunity to become better acquainted in the days ahead." Frank seemed surprised by the direct address, but recovered quickly. "Yes, ma'am. Any time you'd like to see more of the operation, just say the word." When Frank and Ruth had gone, Thomas and Clara stood alone in the parlor, the weight of what they'd done settling between them. Husband and wife, bound by law and vows, yet still strangers in every way that mattered. "Well," Thomas said, uncharacteristically, at a loss for words. "Would you like some refreshment?" Ruth prepared a small wedding breakfast. "That would be lovely," Clara replied, her voice steady beneath the veil. They ate in the dining room, the table seeming too large for just the two of them. Clara lifted her veil only enough to take small bites, keeping her face turned away from Thomas. The barrier between them felt both physical and symbolic, a reminder of the unusual terms of their union. "I've had the blue bedroom prepared for you," Thomas said, as they finished their meal. "It has the best view of the mountains. My mother always said the sunrise there was worth waking early for." "And your quarters?" Clara asked practically. "Across the hall," Thomas replied. That is, I assumed you'd prefer separate rooms, at least initially." Clara nodded. "A considerate arrangement. Thank you." The awkwardness between them was palpable. They had discussed finances, household management, and the practical aspects of their arrangement, but had skirted the most intimate implications of marriage. Now, as husband and wife, those unspoken questions loomed larger. "I have some correspondence to attend to," Thomas said, rising from the table. "Perhaps you'd like to rest or explore the house further?" "I think I'll spend some time in the library," Clara replied. "Your collection seems quite impressive." Thomas nodded, relieved to have a reason to withdraw. "Of course. We'll dine at 7 as usual." The day passed slowly, each of them occupied with their own activities. Thomas found himself unusually distracted as he wrote letters to his cattle buyers and reviewed supply inventories. The knowledge that he was now a married man, that Clara was now Mrs. Mitchell, felt strange and unsettling. At dinner, Clara appeared wearing a dark green dress, high-necked and elegant. The scarf was back, covering the left side of her face. Thomas found himself studying what he could see of her features, trying to imagine what lay beneath the concealment. Their conversation remained polite but reserved, neither mentioning the change in their status. It was almost as if the morning ceremony had never happened, save for the gold band now adorning Clara's left hand. After dinner, they retired to the parlor, where Clara sat with a book while Thomas reviewed the ranch ledgers. The domesticity of the scene felt both forced and oddly comforting, two people sharing space while maintaining careful distance. As the clock struck 10, Clara closed her book. "I believe I'll retire for the evening." Thomas looked up from his work. "Of course. Sleep well, Mrs. Mitchell." The new name hung in the air between them. Clara paused, as if weighing her response. "Thomas," she said finally, "may I speak plainly?" He set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "Please do. We have entered into this marriage with clear expectations on both sides, a practical arrangement for mutual benefit." She folded her hands in her lap. "But there is one aspect we have avoided discussing directly." Thomas felt his collar grow tight. "Yes, the matter of marital relations." Clara's visible eye met his steadily, though he detected a slight tremor in her voice. "I understand that heirs are a primary motivation for your agreement to this match." Thomas cleared his throat, unaccustomed to such direct conversation with a woman. "That was one consideration, yes. Then I believe we should address it," Clara continued. "Not tonight, perhaps, but soon. After all, a contract unfulfilled serves neither party." Her clinical approach to such an intimate matter left Thomas momentarily speechless. This was not the shy, grateful bride he had expected. Once again, Clara Winters, now Mitchell, defied his expectations. "I had thought to give you time," he said carefully, "to become more comfortable with your new circumstances." A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, crossed the visible portion of Clara's face. "How considerate. But I assure you, I'm fully aware of what I agreed to. I don't require coddling or false sentiment." Thomas nodded slowly. "Very well. We'll discuss this further, when you're ready." "Good night, Mr. Mitchell." Clara rose, straightening her skirts. "Or shall I call you Thomas now?" "Thomas would be appropriate, I think." "Then good night, Thomas." She moved toward the door, then paused. "And you should call me Clara." After she left, Thomas remained in the parlor for a long time, staring into the dying fire. Clara continued to surprise him. Her directness, her intelligence, her practical approach to even the most delicate matters. She was nothing like the women he had known in Pine Valley, with their fluttering eyelashes and practiced helplessness. There was something almost masculine in her straightforwardness, yet undeniably feminine in her bearing and manner. The contradiction intrigued him more than he cared to admit. That night, Alone in his bedroom, Thomas found himself wondering about the woman sleeping across the hall. Not just what lay beneath her scarf, but what lay beneath her composed exterior. What dreams and fears occupied Clara Mitchell's mind as she drifted into sleep on her first night as a married woman? For the first time in years, Thomas fell asleep thinking of someone other than himself and his ranch. The next morning brought a return to routine. Thomas rose early, as was his habit, and found Clara already in the breakfast room, dressed for the day in a practical blue dress, her hair neatly pinned, the scarf arranged as usual to cover the left side of her face. "Good morning," she greeted him. "Ruth mentioned you prefer coffee with your breakfast. I've taken the liberty of pouring it for you." Thomas sat at his place, noting the steaming cup waiting for him. "Thank you. You're an early riser." "I've always found the morning hours most productive," Clara replied, spreading a small amount of preserves on her toast. "I hope you don't mind, but I've asked Ruth to show me the household accounts after breakfast. I'd like to understand how things have been managed." Thomas nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. It was prepared exactly as he liked it. Strong, with just a touch of cream. "Of course, though I should warn you, they're not as orderly as they might be. Since my mother's passing, the household has run—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Haphazardly," Clara suggested. Thomas gave a rueful smile. "I was going to say efficiently enough, but your assessment may be more accurate." "Well, that's easily remedied. A well-ordered household runs more economically as well as more comfortably." Clara took a small bite of her toast, managing the maneuver with practiced care to avoid disturbing her scarf. Thomas found himself oddly interested in watching her eat, not out of morbid curiosity about her hidden features, but because of the deliberate grace with which she navigated her self-imposed limitation. Everything about Clara suggested a woman who had learned to adapt to obstacles with careful planning rather than surrender to them. "I have to ride out to the north pasture today," Thomas said. "We're moving the herd to winter grazing. I may not return until late." Clara nodded. "I'll keep myself occupied. There's much to learn about the house." "Frank will be here if you need anything," Thomas added. "And Jessie stays on the property when I'm away." "I'm not afraid of being alone, Thomas," Clara said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I managed quite well in Boston." Thomas felt a flash of irritation at her misinterpretation. "I wasn't suggesting you were afraid, merely informing you of the resources available." Clara's visible eyes studied him for a moment. "I apologize if I seem dismissive. I'm not accustomed to having my welfare be someone else's concern." The admission softened something in Thomas. "Well, you'll have to become accustomed to it. You're Mrs. Mitchell now. Your welfare is very much my concern." A complicated expression crossed the visible portion of Clara's face. Surprise, perhaps, or caution. "As yours is mine, I suppose. Partnership works both ways." Thomas finished his coffee, struck by how quickly this woman had established herself as an equal voice in his home. Most men would find it unsettling. Thomas discovered to his surprise that he found it refreshing. "I should go. The men will be waiting." He rose from the table. Would you like me to bid you goodbye before I leave?" Clara seemed taken aback by the question. Yes, I suppose that would be proper." Thomas nodded, feeling oddly formal. "Until later, then." An hour later, dressed in his riding clothes and ready to depart, Thomas found Clara in the library, already making notes in a small ledger as she examined the shelves. "Your collection needs better organization," she said without looking up. "There are first editions mixed with newer volumes and no discernible cataloging system." Thomas paused in the doorway. "My father collected the books. My mother arranged them. I haven't touched them since she died." Clara glanced up, her expression softening. "I see." Well, perhaps we could preserve your mother's general arrangement while introducing some practical improvements. With your permission, of course. You don't need my permission to arrange books, Clara, Thomas said. This is your home now. Make it as you see fit. She set down her pencil, studying him with that measuring gaze. Thank you. That's generous. Not generous, practical. Thomas stepped further into the room. I'm leaving now. Should be back by supper, but don't wait if I'm delayed. Clara rose, smoothing her skirts. Be careful, she said, the words seeming to surprise her as much as him. The weather looks changeable today. Thomas nodded, unexpectedly touched by her concern. I know this land. I'll be fine. An awkward moment passed between them. Neither sure of the proper farewell between newlywed strangers. Thomas finally settled on a small bow, which Clara acknowledged with a nod. As he rode out with Frank and the ranch hands, Thomas found himself thinking about Clara's parting words. Be careful. Simple words, but ones he hadn't heard directed at him in years, not since his mother's death. Words that suggested he mattered. To someone not just as the owner of Evergreen Ranch, but as a man. It was a strange feeling, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar enough to be disorienting. The day's work was grueling, moving cattle always was, and complicated by an early snowfall that began around noon. By the time they had the herd settled in the sheltered winter grazing lands, darkness was falling, and the snow was coming down in earnest. Need to hurry if we're going to make it back tonight, boss, Frank said, eyeing the sky with concern. Storm's picking up. Thomas nodded, surveying the darkening landscape. We'll take the creek path. It's shorter. They rode hard through thickening snow, the temperature dropping rapidly as night closed in. Thomas's thoughts turned to the warm house waiting for him, and to Clara, perhaps wondering where he was, perhaps not giving him a thought at all. It was fully dark when they finally approached the ranch, the windows of the main house glowing, with welcoming light through the swirling snow. As they neared the stables, Thomas was surprised to see a figure hurrying toward them, a lantern held high. It was Clara, a heavy coat thrown over her dress, her head covered by a woolen scarf that concealed her face from the bitter wind. Thank goodness, she called over the rising storm. Ruth and I were growing concerned. Thomas dismounted, handing his reins to Jesse. You shouldn't be out in this weather, he said, but there was no censure in his tone, only surprise at her presence. Neither should you, yet here we both are, Clara replied, holding the lantern higher to illuminate their way. I've had hot water prepared for washing, and Ruth has kept dinner warm. Frank and the other hands exchanged glances, clearly amused by the sight of Thomas Mitchell being fussed over by his new wife. Thomas ignored them, taking the lantern from Clara's hand. Go inside, he said firmly. I'll be in as soon as I've seen to the horses. The horses have Jesse and the others to care for them, Clara countered. You have me. Now come inside before you catch your death in this cold. Her directness left no room for argument. Thomas found himself following her, toward the house, aware of Frank's poorly concealed smile behind him. Inside, the warmth was a blessing after hours in the biting cold. Clara helped him remove his snow-covered coat and led him to the study, where a fire blazed in the hearth and a glass of whiskey waited on his desk. Change out of those wet clothes, she instructed. I'll tell Ruth to serve dinner in 20 minutes. Before Thomas could respond, Clara had left the room, closing the door behind her with quiet efficiency. He stood there a moment, bemused by the authority in her voice and his own uncharacteristic compliance. 20 minutes later, warmed by dry clothes and the fire, Thomas entered the dining room to find Clara waiting for him. The table was set for two, steam rising invitingly from covered dishes. You didn't need to wait, Thomas said, taking his seat. I preferred to, Clara replied simply. How was the cattle drive? As they ate, Thomas found himself describing the day's work in more detail than he ever had to anyone. Clara listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest and surprising knowledge of ranching operations. "You seem well informed about cattle management," Thomas observed. "I read extensively before coming west," Clara explained. "I believed it prudent to understand the business I would be adjacent to, if not directly involved in." "Adjacent?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You're the rancher's wife now. That makes you directly involved." Clara's visible eye widened slightly. "I hadn't expected you to see it that way." "Why wouldn't I? This ranch is my life's work. You're now part of that life." Thomas surprised himself with the declaration, but found he meant it. "Unless you'd prefer to limit your involvement to household matters." "No," Clara said quickly. "Not at all. I simply didn't want to presume." Thomas studied her across the table, noting the intelligence in her gaze and the careful dignity with which she held herself despite her concealment. A thought occurred to him, one that would have seemed absurd days ago. "Would you like to learn to ride?" he asked. "To see the ranch properly?" Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Ride? On horseback?" "That's generally what riding means," Thomas said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I've never—" Clara hesitated. "In Boston, ladies ride side saddle, and only in parks or controlled settings. I've had limited experience." "This isn't Boston," Thomas replied. "Most women in Wyoming ride astride. It's a practical necessity. Ruth rides. So do most of the women in Pine Valley." Clara considered this, setting down her fork. "Would it be appropriate for your wife to be seen riding about the ranch like a common worker?" "My wife," Thomas said deliberately, "should be able to navigate her own property. And there's nothing common about knowing how to ride well in this territory. It can be a matter of life and death." Clara was silent for a moment, her gaze distant as she considered his offer. Then decisively, "Yes, I would like to learn. Though, I must warn you, I may not be a natural horsewoman." "Few are at first," Thomas assured her, "but you strike me as someone who masters what she sets her mind to." A small smile appeared on the visible side of Clara's face. "You're beginning to know me well." Thomas Mitchell. That night, as Thomas prepared for bed, he found himself reflecting on the changes Clara had already brought to Evergreen Ranch. In just 2 days as his wife, she had begun reorganizing the household, shown genuine concern for his welfare, and expressed interest in learning about the ranch operations. She was proving to be not just a practical addition to his life, but a potentially valuable partner. And yet, there remained the mystery of what lay beneath her scarf, and the question of when, or if, she would ever trust him enough to reveal it. As he drifted towards sleep, Thomas realized something surprising. He was no longer dreading the moment of revelation. Instead, he was growing curious about the woman herself, beyond whatever mark or deformity she bore. Clara Mitchell was becoming, against all expectations, interesting. That evening, Thomas found himself standing awkwardly outside Clara's bedroom door. Their arrangement had been clear, yet the reality of it now loomed uncomfortable and strange. He knocked softly. After a moment, Clara's voice invited him in. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp. Clara sat at the vanity, her back to him, still fully dressed. In the mirror's reflection, Thomas could see she wore no veil, no scarf, but her face was turned away from the glass. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly. "My husband." "Mrs. Mitchell," he replied, the name foreign on his tongue. He cleared his throat. "I want you to know that I don't expect, that is, we can wait until you're more comfortable with showing you my face." Clara finished, still not turning. "That's the true test, isn't it? Whether the cattle baron can stomach his ugly bride long enough to produce an heir?" Thomas flinched at her bluntness. "That's not what I—" "It's all right, Thomas," she said, using his given name for the first time. "I've lived with this face for 30 years. I know what effect it has on people." Slowly, she turned to face him. Thomas's breath caught. The left side of Clara's face was marked by a red birthmark that spread from her temple down her cheek to the corner of her mouth. Her left eye, blue, like the right, was partially surrounded by the discoloration, but it wasn't the birthmark that struck him speechless. It was the fact that, despite it, or perhaps because of the character it gave her face, Clara Winters Mitchell was beautiful. Not in the conventional way of painted ladies or society debutantes, but with a striking uniqueness that commanded attention. High cheekbones, intelligent eyes, a mouth that even now curved slightly at his stunned expression. "Not what you expected?" she asked, a vulnerability beneath her composed tone. Thomas found his voice. "No," he admitted honestly, "it's not." Clara nodded once, shoulders stiffening. "I understand if you prefer I resume wearing the veil in your presence." "That's not—" Thomas stepped closer, seeing the birthmark for what it was. Skin, nothing more, nothing less. "You're not ugly, Clara." A flash of something, anger, pain, crossed her face. "Don't patronize me, Mr. Mitchell. I've endured quite enough of that in my life." "I'm not," Thomas said, surprising himself with his vehemence. "Boston society may have its rigid notions of beauty, but out here, we value different things. Strength, resilience, intelligence." He gestured to the window, to the harsh, beautiful landscape beyond. "This land doesn't care about perfect features. It cares about survival." Clara studied him, searching for mockery and finding none. "And you, Thomas Mitchell, what do you care about?" The question hung between them, unexpectedly weighty. Thomas had built his life around acquisition, more land, more cattle, more wealth. He had never stopped to consider what truly mattered to him. Looking at Clara, really looking at her, he felt something shift inside him. This woman had faced a world that judged her harshly and built herself anyway. Educated, composed, unbroken. "I'm beginning to think," he said slowly, "that I care about things I never recognized before." Clara's expression softened slightly. "Then perhaps this arrangement may prove beneficial in ways neither of us anticipated." Thomas nodded, suddenly aware of the distance between them and how much he wanted to close it. "May I?" he asked, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Clara placed her hand in his. Thomas drew her gently to her feet, then, with careful movements, reached up to touch the marked side of her face. Clara flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. "Your birthmark doesn't define you," he said quietly. "Just as my ranch doesn't define me, though I suspect we've both forgotten that truth at times." "It's not always easy to separate ourselves from how the world sees us," Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then perhaps," Thomas said, "we should help each other remember. That night they didn't consummate their marriage. Instead, they talked, really talked, until the lamp burned low." Clara spoke of growing up marked in a society obsessed with perfection. Thomas shared the crushing responsibility of building on his father's legacy while watching his mother fade away. Two people who had carried their burdens alone for so long, suddenly finding that sharing them made them lighter. "In Boston, children would cry when they saw me," Clara said, her voice steady despite the painful memory. "Their mothers would pull them away, whispering about God's punishment or the devil's mark. As if a birthmark could indicate moral character." Thomas listened, anger building at the cruelty she had endured. "People fear what they don't understand," he said. "It's no excuse." "Eventually, I learned to wear the veil. It was easier than seeing the disgust in people's eyes." Clara touched the birthmark lightly. My father insisted I receive an education despite society's conviction that I had no future as a wife. At least you'll have your mind, he would say. He sounds like a wise man, Thomas observed. He was, Clara agreed, though he never understood why I refused the surgeries. Doctors claimed they could reduce the mark with new techniques, but the risks were substantial. Blindness, scarring worse than the birthmark itself. You chose to remain as you are, Thomas said. Not a question, but an acknowledgement of her. Courage, Clara nodded. I decided young that if the world couldn't accept me as I was, then I wouldn't contort myself to fit its narrow vision. Thomas found himself admiring her resolve. I wish I had shown that kind of backbone with my father, he admitted. I spent years trying to prove myself worthy of his land, his name. Even after his death, I've measured every decision against what I thought he would have done. And have you succeeded in becoming the man he wanted you to be? Thomas considered. This, looking around the room, the fine furnishings, the large house, all symbols of prosperity he had chased relentlessly. I've exceeded his holdings 3 times over, built a ranch larger than he ever dreamed of. That wasn't my question, Clara said gently. Thomas met her gaze, struck by the perception in those blue eyes. No, it wasn't. As the days passed, a quiet rhythm developed between them. Thomas went about his ranching duties. Clara brought order to the household. They took their meals together, discussing the events of the day with increasing ease. Thomas found himself looking forward to these conversations, to Clara's insightful observations and unexpected questions. A week after their wedding, Thomas kept his promise to teach Clara to ride. The day dawned clear and mild, unusual for November, but perfect for a first lesson. I've chosen Willow for you, Thomas said, leading Clara to the stables where a gentle brown mare waited, already saddled. She's steady and patient, good qualities in a first mount. Clara approached the horse cautiously. She wore a divided riding skirt Thomas had ordered from the general store in Pine Valley, and her hair was tied back in a practical knot. The scarf remained in place, but she seemed less concerned about it shifting or revealing her face around Thomas now. "Hello, Willow," she said softly, reaching out a gloved hand to the mare's nose. The horse snuffled gently, accepting her touch without hesitation. "She likes you," Thomas observed. "That's a good start." Clara smiled, the expression transforming her face. Thomas realized it was the first genuine smile he had seen from her, broad enough to crease the visible side of her face and brighten her eyes. "Now what?" she asked, looking both nervous and determined. "Now we get you in the saddle." Thomas positioned himself beside the horse. "Put your left foot in the stirrup, grab the saddle horn, and I'll help you up." Clara did as instructed, and Thomas placed his hands at her waist, lifting her smoothly onto the horse's back. The contact, his hands on her waist, her body momentarily supported by his strength, was the most intimate they had shared since their wedding night conversation. Thomas felt her tense, then relax as she settled into the saddle. "How does it feel?" he asked, stepping back. Clara adjusted her position, grasping the reins as Thomas had shown her. Strange. High, but not unpleasant. "The key is to move with the horse, not against it," Thomas explained, mounting his own stallion Thunder. "We'll go slowly around the corral until you feel comfortable." For the next hour, they circled the practice area, Thomas offering guidance as Clara gained confidence. She was a quick study, her initial stiffness gradually giving way to more natural movements. By the end of the lesson, she was posting competently at a trot, her face flushed with exertion and achievement. "You're a natural," Thomas said as he helped her dismount. Her hands rested on his shoulders, his at her waist again, and for a moment, after her feet touched the ground, neither moved away. "I had an excellent teacher," Clara replied, her voice softer than usual. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that their arrangement might be evolving into something neither had anticipated. Thomas stepped back first, clearing his throat. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "If you're not too sore." "I'll be here," Clara promised, "though I suspect I'll discover muscles I never knew I possessed." That evening at dinner, Clara winced slightly as she took her seat, confirming Thomas's prediction about soreness. But her eyes were bright with a new confidence he hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking about the winter garden," she said as they ate, "the one attached to the kitchen. With proper planning, we could grow herbs and some hardier vegetables even through the cold months. It would reduce our dependence on preserved foods." Thomas nodded, intrigued by her practical thinking. "What would you need?" "Glass panels for part of the roof, better insulation along the north wall. Seeds, of course." Clara laid out her plan with the same precision she applied to the household accounts. The initial investment would be recouped within 2 growing seasons, by my calculations. "You've given this considerable thought," Thomas observed. "I have time to think while organizing your mother's disaster of a linen closet," Clara replied, with a touch of humor. "Did the woman never discard anything?" "I found sheets with mending upon mending." Thomas smiled, remembering. She believed in using things until they couldn't possibly serve anymore. Waste not, want not was practically her religion. A sensible philosophy, Clara agreed, though perhaps taken to extremes in this case. Their conversation flowed more easily now, punctuated by occasional laughter. Thomas found himself sharing stories of his childhood on the ranch, the time he'd fallen from the hayloft and broken his arm, the spring roundup when he'd first been allowed to ride with the men, the Christmas his mother had somehow procured, an orange for each family member, despite the blizzard that had isolated them for weeks. Clara listened attentively, offering her own memories of Boston, the harbor in summer, the libraries and bookshops she had haunted, the rare professor who had treated her as an intellect rather than an object of pity. As the evening drew to a close, Thomas realized they had talked for hours without once mentioning ranch finances or household management. They had simply enjoyed each other's company, as friends might. Perhaps even as a husband and wife might, in a marriage of more conventional origins. That night, as Thomas prepared for bed, a knock sounded at his door. He opened it to find Clara standing in the hallway, dressed in a modest nightgown with a robe tied securely over it. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her face was uncovered, the birthmark visible in the dim light of the corridor. "Clara," he said, surprised, "is everything all right?" "May I come in?" she asked quietly. Thomas stepped aside, suddenly aware that he wore only his nightshirt and trousers. Clara entered, her movements betraying a nervousness that contrasted with her usual composure. "I've been thinking," she said, standing in the center of the room, not meeting his eyes, "about our arrangement, about its purpose." Thomas felt his heart rate increase. "Yes, I believe it's time we... That is, if you're amenable." She faltered, her customary directness deserting her. Thomas approached slowly, stopping an arm's length away. "Clara, are you saying..." "I'm saying that if we are to have a true marriage, we should commence with its full obligations." Clara finally looked up, her expression a complex mixture of resolve and vulnerability. "I'm ready, if you are." Thomas studied her face, both sides of it now familiar to him. The birthmark no longer drew his attention as it once had. Instead, he saw the intelligence in her eyes, the determination in the set of her mouth, the quiet dignity she carried despite the world's cruelty. "Are you certain?" he asked, needing to be sure. Clara nodded. "Yes, though I should warn you, I have no experience in these matters. My education, extensive as it is, has certain practical gaps." The admission, delivered with such characteristic forthrightness, stirred something protective in Thomas. This remarkable woman, who had faced a hostile world with such courage, now stood before him, offering her trust in the most intimate way possible. "Neither do I," Thomas confessed. "Not really. There have been encounters, but nothing of significance. Nothing with someone I respected." Clara's eyes widened slightly at his honesty. "Then we shall learn together," she said softly. Thomas reached out, gently taking her hand. "Yes," he agreed, "together." That night, in the quiet darkness of Thomas's bedroom, two people who had expected a marriage of convenience discovered something neither had dared hope for: connection. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, hesitations, whispered questions. But there was also tenderness, consideration, and a growing warmth between two souls who had resigned themselves to isolation. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked afterward, as Clara lay beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. "Yes," she replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Better than all right." Thomas drew her closer, marveling at how natural it felt to hold her. "Good." In the weeks that followed, Pine Valley watched in amazement as Thomas Mitchell, the cold-hearted cattle baron, was transformed by the woman they had expected to pity. Clara walked through town without her veil, her head high despite the stares. She implemented new breeding programs that increased the ranch's productivity. She started a small classroom for the ranch hands' children, teaching them herself 3 afternoons a week. When Edward Sullivan came calling about the loan, Clara met him in Thomas's study, ledgers open before her, and outlined exactly why his services would no longer be required. The banker left with his hat crushed between his hands, outmaneuvered by the woman he'd called Mitchell's pitiful mail-order bride behind closed doors. "You should have seen Sullivan's face," Thomas told Frank after the banker's departure. Clara had calculated alternative financing options down to the penny. The man didn't know whether to be outraged or impressed. Frank chuckled. "Mrs. Mitchell's something else, boss. Not what any of us expected." "No," Thomas agreed, watching through the window as Clara inspected the new greenhouse construction. "She's far more." As winter settled over Pine Valley, transforming the landscape into a white wilderness, life at Evergreen Ranch took on a warmth it had lacked for years. The house, once merely a symbol of Thomas's success, became a home. Clara filled it with small touches, fresh arrangements of pine branches and berries, quilts draped over chairs, lamps lit against the early darkness. Thomas found himself hurrying back from his daily rounds, eager to return to Clara's company. Their evenings were spent in comfortable conversation or companionable silence. Clara with her books or embroidery, Thomas with his ranch ledgers or correspondence. Their nights were increasingly spent together, the initial awkwardness giving way to a deepening intimacy that surprised and satisfied them both. One evening in early December, Thomas returned from town to find Clara waiting for him in the parlor, an unusual tension in her posture. "What is it?" he asked, setting aside his hat and gloves. "Has something happened?" Clara met his gaze directly. "I've received a letter from Boston, from my cousin Harriet." Thomas nodded, sitting across from her. "Bad news?" "Not exactly." Clara smoothed the letter in her lap. "She writes that my father's former business partner, Mr. Hargrove, has expressed interest in purchasing my father's library. The scientific volumes in particular. He's offering a substantial sum." "That sounds like good news," Thomas observed, puzzled by her distress. "It would be, except that I'd need to return to Boston to oversee the sale. The collection needs to be properly catalogued and appraised." Clara hesitated. "Harriet suggests I come for the Christmas season. She says it would provide an opportunity to show Boston society that I've improved my situation." Thomas understood then. Clara would be returning to the place that had rejected her, to people who had judged her as lesser. and Harriet saw her marriage not as a partnership, but as a fortunate escape for a flawed woman. "Do you want to go?" he asked simply. Clara's eyes flickered with surprise at the question. "I don't know. The money would be useful for the spring expansion plans, and the books are gathering dust in storage. They should go to someone who values them." "That's not what I asked," Thomas said gently. "Do you want to go back to Boston, to face those people again?" Clara was silent for a long moment, considering. "Part of me wants to show them that their judgment didn't destroy me," she admitted, "that I've built a life of value despite their cruelty. But another part is afraid," Thomas finished for her. "Not afraid," Clara corrected quickly, then sighed. "Yes, perhaps afraid. Not of their opinions, but of my own reactions, of feeling again as I did there, small, marked, lesser." Thomas moved to sit beside her, taking her hand in his. "You are not lesser, Clara Mitchell. You never were." She smiled at him, the expression now unreserved, the birthmark creasing along with the rest of her features. "I know that here," she touched her head. "But knowing and feeling are different matters." "Then we'll go together," Thomas said decisively. Clara blinked. "Together, but the ranch, Frank can manage for a few weeks. I haven't left this valley in 8 years, Clara. Perhaps it's time I saw something of the world." He squeezed her hand. "And I find I'm curious about the society that was foolish enough to undervalue my wife." Clara's eyes shone with sudden moisture. "You would do that, travel all that way, disrupt your routines, just to stand beside me? Isn't that what partners do?" Thomas asked, using the word she had first applied to their marriage. "Stand together?" The smile that illuminated Clara's face then was worth every mile of the journey they would undertake, every disruption to Thomas's carefully ordered life. In that moment, he realized fully what had been gradually becoming clear over the past weeks. His practical marriage had become something far more precious than he could have imagined. He loved Clara Mitchell. Her mind, her courage, her unexpected humor, even the birthmark that had shaped her life so profoundly. He loved the way she challenged him, supported him, stood as his equal. He loved the life they were building together. "Thomas?" Clara's voice broke into his thoughts. "What are you thinking?" He looked at his wife, his partner, his friend, his lover, and said simply, "That I'm a fortunate man." 2 weeks later, Thomas and Clara boarded the eastbound train, their trunks packed for a month-long stay in Boston. Clara wore a stylish new traveling outfit, her hair arranged fashionably, her face uncovered despite the curious glances of their fellow passengers. "Second thoughts?" Thomas asked as the train pulled away from Pine Valley Station. Clara shook her head, taking his hand. "No. Whatever awaits us in Boston, we'll face it together." As the Wyoming landscape slipped away behind them, replaced by the rolling plains of Nebraska and beyond, Thomas reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. He had agreed to marry an ugly woman for practical reasons, continuation of his bloodline, financial security for his ranch, a respectable position in society. Instead, he had found a partner whose beauty ran deeper than skin, whose value couldn't be calculated in ledgers or land deeds. He had found, in the most unlikely of arrangements, love. And as Clara rested her head against his shoulder, her birthmark cheek visible to anyone who cared to look, Thomas Mitchell knew with absolute certainty that he had made the best bargain of his life. Back in Pine Valley, the gossips at the Watering Hole Saloon had moved on to fresh subjects. The story of Thomas Mitchell and his mysterious bride had lost its novelty, replaced by talk of the railroad expansion and Sheriff Davis's courtship of the new school teacher. But occasionally, someone would still remark on the transformation of Evergreen Ranch, how the once forbidding estate now hosted community gatherings, how the stern cattle baron now smiled and engaged with townspeople, how the unfortunate Mrs. Mitchell had proven herself anything but pitiful. Guess appearances can be deceiving, Mabel Jenkins would observe, wiping down the bar with her ever-present cloth. In more ways than one. And in Boston, as snow fell on the cobblestone streets and gas lamps glowed against the early darkness, a remarkable couple stepped from a carriage, a tall, weathered man with the bearing of someone accustomed to open spaces, and a woman whose uncovered face bore both a prominent birthmark and an unmistakable confidence. They paused before ascending the steps to Harriet's townhouse, and the man bent to whisper something in his wife's ear. She laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained, and in that moment, every passerby who chanced to see them recognized the same truth. Here was beauty, unmasked and undeniable, not in perfection of features, but in the connection between two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed: acceptance, partnership, and love. Boston in winter was a city of contrasts. Grand townhouses with glowing windows, set against grey skies, fashionable ladies in furs stepping carefully around street children huddled near steam grates. For Thomas, accustomed to the vast openness of Wyoming, the narrow streets felt confining, the constant noise jarring. But he kept these observations to himself, his attention focused on Clara as she faced her past. Harriet's reception of them was cordial, if cool. A thin woman with pinched features and calculating eyes, she assessed Thomas as one might evaluate livestock, noting his well-tailored but provincial suit, his weathered complexion, his direct manner of speech. "Well, Clara," she said after introductions were complete, "you certainly found yourself a substantial husband." The emphasis suggested she was referring to Thomas's physical presence rather than his character. "Indeed I did," Clara replied evenly. "Thomas is everything I could have hoped for." They were given adjoining rooms in Harriet's elegant townhouse. That first night, as they prepared for a small dinner Harriet had arranged to introduce Thomas to suitable society, Clara's composure began to fray. "I should never have suggested coming here," she said, pacing the bedroom. "Harriet's assembled. The exact circle of people who made my life miserable. The Winthrops, the Cabots, even Regina Standish, who once said I should wear a mask for the comfort of others." Thomas, struggling with his formal tie, abandoned it to take Clara's hands. "Listen to me, we don't have to attend. We can send our regrets, handle the business with the books, and return home." Clara's eyes softened at his use of the word home. Evergreen Ranch, not Boston. "No," she said resolutely. "I won't hide, not anymore, not with you beside me." At dinner, Thomas witnessed firsthand the casual cruelty Clara had endured. The conversations flowed around her as if she were invisible, except when someone made a pointed remark about unfortunate appearances or the blessing of finding any husband at all in such circumstances. Thomas, initially dismissed as an unsophisticated Westerner, watched Clara's spine stiffen with each subtle barb. Then, as a particularly venomous woman expressed amazement that Clara had secured a husband despite her affliction, Thomas set down his fork with deliberate precision. "Mrs. Winthrop," he said, his voice carrying easily across the table, "where I come from, we value substance over appearance. My wife's intelligence, courage, and character make her the most beautiful woman in this room, a fact apparent to anyone. With the sense God gave a fence post." A stunned silence fell over the table. Clara's visible eye widened in surprise, then warmed with gratitude. Harriet looked mortified, but Thomas continued, addressing the entire gathering now. "In Wyoming Territory, we judge people by their actions, not their features. Clara manages our ranch finances with extraordinary skill, has implemented breeding, programs that increased our herd's quality substantially, and has established educational opportunities for children who would otherwise go without. I'd like to hear what comparable contributions any of you have made to your communities." No one answered. Some guests studied their plates, others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Thomas nodded, as if their silence confirmed his point. I thought as much. Now, if you'll excuse the provincial observation, it seems to me that true ugliness isn't found in a birthmark, but in the deliberate cruelty of those who should know better. He returned to his meal as if nothing unusual had occurred, though under the table Clara's hand found his and squeezed tightly. The remainder of dinner passed in strained conversation, with several guests making early departures. As the last of them filed out, Harriet confronted Thomas in the foyer. "Mr. Mitchell, while I appreciate your protective instincts, you've destroyed Clara's social prospects in Boston. Those people have influence in circles that matter." Thomas looked down at the woman, unimpressed by her concern. "Circles that matter to whom, Mrs. Winters? Not to Clara, not anymore." Later that night, in the privacy of their adjoining rooms, Clara came to Thomas, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "No one has ever defended me like that," she said softly. "Not even my father." Thomas drew her close. "They had no right to treat you that way, no right at all." "Their opinion shouldn't matter," Clara whispered against his chest, "yet I still feel that young girl inside me, desperate for acceptance." "It's hard to silence those voices," Thomas acknowledged. "I still hear my father sometimes, telling me I'm not working hard enough, not achieving enough." Clara looked up at him. "When did it start? This need to prove yourself?" Thomas sighed, the memory still sharp despite the years. "I was 10 when my father lost half our herd in a flash flood. He'd insisted on grazing them in a canyon despite warnings about the weather. Afterward, he was different, harder. Nothing I did was ever enough to restore what he'd lost. Not just the cattle, but his confidence, his standing with the other ranchers." "So you became the son who would never fail," Clara observed. "Just as I became the woman who had to be twice as accomplished to be considered half as valuable." Thomas nodded, struck by the parallel. "Two people trying to outrun shadows. Perhaps," Clara said, "it's time we both stopped running." The business of the book collection proceeded more smoothly than their social engagements. Mr. Hargrove, a serious-minded academic with little interest in social gossip, treated Clara with professional respect, focusing on the value of her father's scientific volumes rather than the mark on her face. The sale brought a better price than anticipated, enough to fund not only the spring expansion at Evergreen Ranch, but also the school building Clara had been quietly planning. As they concluded the transaction in Mr. Hargrove's office, the older man made an observation that stayed with Thomas. "Your father would be pleased, Mrs. Mitchell, not just with the disposition of his collection, but with the woman you've become. He always said your mind was your greatest asset. Clearly he was correct." Clara thanked him with genuine warmth, and as they left, Thomas noticed a new lightness in her step. A piece of her past had been resolved with dignity, providing closure she hadn't realized she needed. Christmas in Boston proved to be a stilted affair at Harriet's house. The woman remained cool toward Thomas after the dinner incident, and their interactions were limited to polite necessities. But Clara seemed unbothered, even amused by her cousin's disapproval. Harriet always believed a woman's highest achievement was a socially advantageous marriage, she told Thomas on Christmas Eve as they sat alone in the small sitting room adjacent to their bedrooms. "She can't comprehend that I've found happiness with a man who values me for myself, not for the connections I bring." Thomas watched his wife in the firelight, struck again by how far they had both come from their first awkward meeting. "Would you have been happy here?" he asked suddenly. "If your life had been different, if you'd been born without the birthmark, married some Boston gentleman, lived in a house like this?" Clara considered the question seriously. "I might have been content," she said finally, But happy? No. I would have been constrained by expectations, limited to managing a household and producing heirs. My education would have been ornamental, not practical. She met his eyes. And I would never have known what it meant to be truly seen, as you see me. Thomas took her hand, the gesture now familiar and cherished. I didn't see you clearly at first, he admitted. I was too focused on what you could provide. Financial stability, an heir, respectability. I didn't understand what a partner really meant. And now? Clara asked softly. Now I know that what we've built together is worth more than any ranch or bloodline, Thomas said. You've made me a better man, Clara Mitchell. As January arrived with bitter cold and swirling snow, they prepared to return to Wyoming. Harriet, in a final attempt to persuade Clara to reconsider her life choices, arranged a tea with some of the city's most prominent matrons. These are reasonable women, Clara, Harriet insisted. Women who understand the importance of social position. You could re-establish yourself here with the right introductions. There are charitable boards that would welcome your father's daughter, especially now that you have the respectability of marriage. Clara exchanged a glance with Thomas, who had been invited as an afterthought. And what of my husband? Would he be welcome in these exalted circles as well? Harriet's hesitation was answer enough. Mr. Mitchell would, I'm sure, understand the value of such connections for your future. My future is in Wyoming, Clara said firmly, with my husband, building something meaningful together. I don't need charitable boards to give my life purpose. The tea proceeded with glacial politeness, the Boston matrons eyeing Clara's birthmark with poorly concealed discomfort, while interrogating Thomas about savage encounters with Indians and the primitive conditions of territorial life. Thomas answered with deliberate good humor, allowing them to believe what they wished about Wyoming, while knowing the reality of his and Clara's life together was beyond their comprehension. These women, with their rigid social hierarchies and narrow definitions of worth, could never understand the partnership he and Clara had forged. As they prepared to depart Boston, Clara made one final visit to her parents' graves in Mount Auburn Cemetery. Thomas accompanied her, standing respectfully aside as she placed winter roses on the cold marble. I've made peace with them, she said, as they walked back through the snow-covered paths. With my mother, who couldn't look at me without grief. With my father, who loved me but couldn't protect me from the world's judgment. She took Thomas's arm. And with the girl I was, always hiding, always apologizing for existing. Thomas covered her gloved hand with his own. She brought you to me, he said simply. I'm grateful to her. The journey west felt like a homecoming in ways Thomas hadn't anticipated. With each mile that brought them closer to Wyoming, both he and Clara seemed to breathe more freely, shed the constraints that Boston had imposed. By the time they reached Nebraska, Clara had abandoned her formal Eastern attire for the more practical clothes she wore at the ranch. Thomas had discarded his uncomfortable collar entirely. Do you miss any of it? Thomas asked as they watched the prairie landscape roll past their window. The theaters, the bookshops, the conveniences of city life? Clara considered this, then shook her head. I miss certain aspects of intellectual life, the lectures, the libraries, but those are small losses compared to what I've gained. She smiled at him, her whole face participating in the expression now, without self-consciousness about her birthmark. Besides, we can create our own version of those things in Pine Valley. The school is just the beginning. Thomas raised an eyebrow. What else are you planning that you haven't told me about, Mrs. Mitchell? Clara's eyes sparkled with mischief. A lending library, perhaps. Musical evenings at the ranch. Maybe even a small theater group. She squeezed his hand. A community needs culture as much as commerce, Thomas, and our children should grow up with both. Our children. The words sent a pleasant shock through Thomas. They hadn't spoken directly of children since their practical discussions before marriage, but now the prospect seemed not just a dynastic necessity, but a joyful possibility. Our children, he repeated softly. I'd like that. Clara's expression turned serious. Even knowing they might inherit my mark, there's a chance, Thomas. The doctors in Boston were quite clear about that. Thomas touched her cheek. The marked sighed, gently. Any child of ours will be loved completely, Clara. Mark or no mark, and they'll grow up knowing their value isn't determined by others' perceptions. That night, as the train rattled through the darkness toward home, Thomas held Clara close in their private compartment, her head resting on his chest, her breathing deep and even in sleep. He thought about the strange path that had led them. Here, a desperate financial situation, a cousin's letter, a practical proposition that had blossomed into something neither of them had dared hope for. He had expected to marry an ugly woman, had reconciled himself to the sacrifice for the sake of his ranch and his legacy. Instead, he had found a partner whose beauty ran far deeper than skin, whose strength complemented his own, whose mind challenged and inspired him daily. As the miles passed beneath the train's wheels, Thomas made a silent promise to himself, to Clara, to their future children. He would never again judge by appearances, never again mistake surface for substance. He would remember, always, that true value was found in character, in courage, in the capacity to grow beyond the limitations others imposed. And he would ensure that Evergreen Ranch became not just a successful cattle operation, but a home where everyone, family, workers, visitors, was judged by the content of their character rather than the accidents of birth or circumstance. When they finally returned to Pine Valley, the town's reception of them was markedly different from the couple's departure. Word of Thomas's defense of Clara in Boston had somehow preceded them, carried by letters from Eastern connections to local gossips. People who had once whispered behind their hands now greeted Clara directly, making eye contact rather than staring at her mark or avoiding her gaze altogether. Frank met them at the station with the ranch wagon, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile at their return. "Place hasn't been the same without you both," he said gruffly. "The men miss your cooking lessons, Mrs. Mitchell, and the boss's level head has been sorely missed during the January thaw. Creek nearly took out the south fence line." As they rode toward Evergreen Ranch, Thomas felt the rightness of their return in his bones. The mountains rose in the distance, familiar and eternal. The winter landscape stretched around them, harsh but beautiful in its starkness. This was home, not just the land, but the life he and Clara were building together. Spring arrived with a rush of activity, new calves, fence repairs, preparations for the summer grazing season. Clara's greenhouse flourished, providing fresh vegetables weeks before the outdoor gardens could be planted. The school building took shape in town, its red brick walls rising steadily under the carpenter's skilled hands. And in late April, as the first wildflowers began to dot the meadows around Evergreen Ranch, Clara shared news that completed the transformation of their practical arrangement into a true family. "Thomas," she said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, "I've seen Dr. Harper today." Thomas turned to her, concern immediate. "Are you unwell?" Clara shook her head, a smile spreading across her face. Both sides, marked and unmarked, equally radiant with joy. "Not unwell, just expecting. In November, Dr. Harper thinks." Thomas stared at her, processing her words, then pulled her gently into his arms. "A child," he whispered against her hair. "Our child. Are you pleased?" Clara asked, her voice betraying a hint of the old vulnerability. Thomas drew back to look at her fully, memorizing every detail of this moment, the hope in her eyes, the slight flush in her cheeks, the mark that had shaped her life so profoundly and had, ultimately, brought her to him. "Please doesn't begin to describe it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm grateful, honored, terrified." He laughed softly. "Mostly terrified, if I'm honest." Clara laughed with him, the sound carrying across the ranch yard. "That makes two of us, but I think perhaps that's how it should be. The most important things in life should inspire a little fear, don't you think? It means we understand their value." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas Mitchell, cattle baron of Evergreen Ranch, held his wife close and reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them. Here, he had thought once that he was agreeing to marry an ugly woman for practical reasons. Instead, he had discovered that true beauty, like true value, was rarely found on the surface. It lived in courage, in kindness, in the ability to face the world's judgment without surrendering to bitterness. It lived in Clara, his wife, his partner, the mother of his unborn child. And as night fell over Evergreen Ranch, Thomas silently thanked whatever fate or providence had brought them together, transforming two lonely souls into a family bound not by necessity or convenience, but by the most powerful force of all: love. Freely given, fully returned, and growing stronger with each passing day. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.